So I'd spoken about the idea of time periods and subgroupings. So if you're thinking about this, prehistoric is the larger umbrella of your time period, and Paleolithic is one of the subgroupings. So for an exam, you would want to know prehistoric, but you'd also want to know if something is Paleolithic. So that is how I'd be looking at identification, right, for a testing situation. So just FYI on that as we move along. You'll see some time periods have subgroupings, some time periods do not. It just really depends on the time period. So again, you'll see this as we move along and really should be thinking about knowing both the umbrella time period and then the subgroupings within. As we already talked about, Paleolithic is a nomadic time. And so a lot of what they focus on is their basic needs. And they're not going to create a lot of permanent art in the way that we perhaps think about permanent art. I always joke that, prehistoric people, talking about them as artists is a little bit probably incorrect. They probably didn't sit around thinking this is art in the way that we do. To them, it was a necessary, purposeful thing, right, that they were making. The cave paintings, for instance, we think that they served some kind of function for them, that the people making these things, they were doing it for a reason. They weren't doing it to make pretty things or aesthetic things. So again, thinking about these people as artists, it's I don't know, it's a little bit perhaps of a misnaming or a misnomer, but it's how we try to handle these objects and link them to the overall history of art. But again, they probably don't match up with our idea of artistship in the most, you know, contemporary way. And I think that's actually true for the whole of this course. You're looking at a lot of artists who are making things for basic needs. You're looking at artists who are doing things to support their religion or their community. You're looking at people who view themselves as artisans, perhaps, but not like craftspeople, but not probably, again, the way we think about being an artist. So it is something interesting to consider. The birth of the modern artist really starts in art history too, with the Renaissance, where people are like, I'm making something, I'm whoever, Michelangelo, Raphael, whatever, and let me show you my contribution to art history. So again, it's interesting to think about, would they view themselves as artists at all? Probably not. I give you the term here sympathetic magic. And this is one of the reasons we think that perhaps they made cave paintings. Now, sympathy here does not function like I feel bad for you. It means more I'm sympathetic to you, like I'm sympathetic to your cause. You're trying to create a condition that benefits you in some kind of way. So it's not about like I'm sad, like in sympathy. No, not really. Again, it's the other meaning. It's, I'm sympathetic to what you're doing. I feel for you and I want to create a condition that benefits you. And so what we think they were trying to do with sympathetic magic is create the condition of a bountiful hunt. They were trying to create the condition of animals being present for them to kill and eat, right, to support their people. So, these pieces are very functional if you think about it. They're not, again, about aesthetics or beauty in that sense. So if you find them pretty, great, but we don't think that was really a concern of theirs. And I think there's a lot of credence to this hypothesis about sympathetic magic and, is it true or not? Because again, it's prehistoric. We never can really prove these things 100%. And the reason why I think there's some validity to it is I went to Africa a couple years ago and went to Tanzania. And I was lucky enough to go meet some of the Masai Mara tribe people. And what the people do there is they actually have the Maasai have a custom, and a lot of tribes have these kind of customs where they'll draw animals like in the sand under the watchful eye of a shaman or a magical person. And you'll hear me bring up shamanism or magic a lot as we talk about some of these objects. But they'll have the shaman kind of overwatching them. There might be chanting or dancing, right? And the warriors will come forward, the hunters will come forward and draw these animals in the dirt, and then they'll stab them with their spears like they're ritualistically killing them. And then they'll run off to the actual hunt. And many people believe that what they're doing with this ritual is they're unleashing the magic that they need to go out into the wild and kill these animals and bring them back to their people. So, one might say, if you think about it, that the similar idea of a tribal African society still living today using sympathetic magic, that we could give some credence to or believability to this is why these people were doing that as well. So I think there's something to be said for the sympathetic magic idea. The cave I used to kind of give us a sense of grounding in our discussion of cave paintings is the cave of Lascaux. This cave is in France And most of the caves that you encounter in southern France, northern Spain, really in this very small segment along the Spanish French border. And there's not a lot of caves that we've found because what we think these people try to do is keep these objects hidden for magical reasons. That if they were thinking about these things as magical, they weren't just thinking about them as something for anyone to see, perhaps. So that's another, sort of hypothesis that people talk about is, were these things meant for public consumption? Probably not. So there's not a lot of caves out there, really. There's Altamira, Peshmal. I'll show you a few of these just inside in passing. But for me, I try to pick one and kind of use that as a focus when I think the objects can become confusing. All cave paintings to me kind of sort of look the same sometimes. So I picked Lascaux because I think it's a great example. You'll notice this is what we call a site plan of Lascaux. So this is an art history term you'll see, which is site, S-I-T-E, not like seeing site, but a place, a site, S-I-T-E. And we use a lot of site plans in art history. It's a way of giving an aerial viewpoint on an object and giving you a better sense of the actual layout of something. Because next I'll show you a photograph of Lascaux, and I'm sure you'll agree it's not easy to get a real good sense of the overall space. When you look at the site plan, you can. You're like, okay, I can get a sense of what this space looks like. It makes sense to me, right? You'll notice you come in the entrance and then you're in the rotunda area, sort of an open area. And then there's different what we call side galleries or axial galleries. Notice that a lot of these paintings are clustered down towards the end of the galleries, and you might find that interesting, but that sort of supports the theory that a lot of these things perhaps were about being hidden or secret or magical, right, in some kind of way. Not for public consumption. And if you think about the conditions that people were painting these under, with burning torches and stuff, it's rather intriguing to consider. So this is the site plan. It gives you a sense of the site of Lascaux. Now here's a photograph of coming into Lascaux. And again, I'm sure you agree that it's a little hard to get a sense of the space. It's better to see the site plan first. But you'll notice that this is in the rotunda area. You look up and you get this amazing sort of view of all these different paintings, right, on the ceiling. And by the way, some people call them drawings, some people call them paintings. I don't really think it matters much. The way that they were being done was being made with organic materials because there's no art store. So if you look at this image, charcoal, burning sticks, that's what would be used to draw these. Or some of the imagery layered underneath was made with what we call ochre, O-C-H-E-R, ochre. And it's an iron oxide that comes from the earth naturally and can be used to stain and dye, right, the rock's surface. You'd also see things like berry juice, blood, but it's all coming from organic sources to make these type of paintings, right? Um, and again, why we think they made them is to conjure up this energy or conjure up this magic or this essence and make the animals in a sense manifest, right? Make them be true, come to life, right? Be available for hunting. It's a very interesting theory about why these things existed. Some other things I want to mention here, just looking at this piece, is notice that these are symbolic people when it comes to representation. Now, what do I mean? Symbolism that means it doesn't have to look real or act real. And then there's realism itself, which is very much about reality. So you'll hear me say these two terms throughout the course. Symbolic art really exists really all the way up to the Greek time period. And then the Greeks, they invent realism in a sense. It's short lived, but they invent it, and then it'll come back in the Renaissance again. But symbolism, as far as early art, is prevalent. And we think this is because people didn't think that things had to look like things were. They didn't understand why that was important. What they thought was important is you understanding the message, and that was foremost. So to them, realism, why bother? Who cares, right? So here you'll notice there's a layering of the images, which, if we think about reality, can't possibly happen. But for them, why not? Who cares? You'll also see like images of animals floating in space in a certain kind of way. If you look at Altamira, that was the first slide I showed you to introduce cave painting. I always say it looks like bison in a blender. They're all sort of kind of look like they're balloons, kind of going around in circles. And there's no real what we call ground line for them to stand on. Here, there seems to be more of a ground line or a sense of perspective of like, where is up and where is down. But most, again, prehistoric artists don't really think that way, we find. They are being very symbolic in how they view the world and how they approach the world. Now, something as a secondary hypothesis I wanted to bring up. So, for many, many years, like especially when I was in my early days of schooling, sympathetic magic was that's what these are. Period. Nothing more, nothing less. There wasn't a lot of flexibility on how to view cave art. Then people started to go through different hypotheses and think about like maybe these things aren't what we think they are. And Chauvet Cave that you see here was one of the things that made people start to think about this. They said if you look at these animals, they're not really what people hunt. If you look, there's rhinoceroses here. Like, if you've ever seen a rhino, I have in Africa. Yeah, they have very thick hide and they're very mean creatures. They're not easy to get close to and they're not easy to kill. So some people started to talk about like, is this really about sympathetic magic or is it about something else? Something like perhaps if you could have a fantasy of your, a glamour kill, might we say? The biggest, craziest animal you could kill, what would it be? Because if you think about bison, they're not really easy to kill either. And they've done archaeological um, sort of analysis of what you actually find Paleolithic people eating. If you look at their what we call middens or their trash piles, essentially, what were they actually eating? And we find they're eating like deer, rabbits, right? Things that are easy to kill, smaller animals. So were they really killing these kind of creatures on a large scale, or is this just fantasy? It's interesting to consider humans, we're very much about fantasy. I mean, go look at people's Facebook profiles. My favorite are like the ones that people are like sitting on like a Porsche, and you're like, they don't have a Porsche. It's this idea of like in your own imagery of yourself, you can make yourself as fantastical or spectacular as you'd like to, especially if people don't know the truth. So why shouldn't prehistoric man function that same way to embellish, right, themselves? So this is an interesting thing to consider. It's like, wow, we're not so different from them, perhaps. And then another theory that came up was this idea of shamanism and the idea of like perhaps these are hallucinogenic images, right? These are things linked to magic and spirituality in a way that is about the otherworldly. Now, shamans, as I mentioned, they're spiritual people in these tribes typically. And again, if you go look at tribal societies today, they still have them. Because when I was in Africa, I met shamans. They were like, "Yeah, I'm the shaman. I'm the magical dude." I'm like, "Okay, wow, this is cool." And normally they function by taking certain kinds of drugs, hallucinogens of some type, that allow them to see beyond the veil, as they put it, into the other world. Now, some people have asked, whether these paintings are about lifting the veil. For a long, long time, this piece was called Spotted Horses until someone finally really looked at it and thought about it and said, well, first off, there's no evidence of spotted horses as a type of horse. And if you really look at the spots, they kind of go over the horses like a pattern. They're not really about the horse. So some people say this is like the shaman getting stoned and going down to the cave and like woo, kind of I'm gonna paint some dots, man. And then you see the hands and I don't know if you've ever seen a stone person, but they woo, their hands become fascinated. They're like, "Whoa, look at my hand," right? I can see into the future, and you're like, "Oh, okay." So this idea of perhaps these people just being stoned out of their minds and being down in the cave, painting these things. I also mentioned they're in the dark with torches. Go in a room that's very pitch black and just sit there for a while. You will start to see colors, you will start to see patterns. It's your eyes compensating from the lack of stimuli, essentially. So these people painting in the dark, what were they seeing? And then were they representing those patterns and images on the walls? I mean, this completely overthrows the whole sympathetic magic thing on a certain level. It's like these are things that are perhaps even more complicated than we even know or understand. The last thing I'll mention about cave paintings is our role in the representation of them. You very rarely see humans show up, and when we do, we're usually getting killed, like you see here. And notice that the bison is shown like this beautiful, glorious creature, right? And then we're like a stick figure. So sad. But that's because animals were where it was at for these people. They didn't really we don't think they cared much about themselves in the way that we do. Like they were very concerned with the needs of the community and surviving. It didn't give you a lot of time for self-reflection, probably. Like, how do you feel today? Who cares, right? I need to go get meat for my people. So the animals you'll notice are always shown as these beautiful magical creatures. And we think that early religion is really about animals. That's what they worshipped. Their early religiosity was their spirituality was linked to animals. So we think that's really what was going on here. And then we again are secondary. We don't really show up a lot in the art. We don't matter essentially because the animals are what's important. Two other details I kind of always mention about this painting. You'll notice that he's very excited to die. It's not just a slip of the brush you see down south on him. You often see hunting images with the hunters have large penises, and often they're erect. We think it's a virility kind of symbol, vitality symbol, because you think about the role of men in the tribe, they were going to be hunters, and then they needed to impregnate the women. So your fertility was probably very much on display. Um, and, the little bird image you see, a lot of people are like, "What's that bird just doing hanging out down there?" That's actually part of his hunting kit. It's what's called an atlatl, ATL, ATL, atlatl. And it's part of, a hunting kit where it helps you throw your spear further, right? It helps to launch the spear. So that's not just like a little bird hanging out, it's part of his hunting kit that he's dropped as he's being obviously mauled by the bison and killed. Notice though he's already, killed the bison though, the guts are hanging out of the bison, so you can see that down there as well. So they're both dying essentially, no one's really won this confrontation. But if you think about the bird atlatl, it sort of relates to the idea of them again relating to animals, perhaps even as like spirit animals. Go look at Native American tribes; they still believe this today.